Hello everybody, welcome to another video of Unscripted History, where today we'll be going over the second part of the reign of Æthelred I. Now, this video will be going over the years kind of 865 to 871, though technically the only parts that really include Æthelred happen in like 867, 868. So to try to start off, what we'll be talking about predominantly here is the Viking raids, or more Viking conquest of England at this point, or the Isle of Britain, because with this, we see as there's a drastic change in how the Vikings were approaching these isles, because at first they were kind of just raiding monasteries here and there, getting some plunder and then leaving. However, in 1865, they set their minds upon conquest. So we see as first they land in East Anglia, and King Edmund, who ruled over East Anglia, was unable to really deal with them. So he ultimately ended up having to pay them off, and they rested up for about a year. And then in late 867, they marched on York and then went into Nottingham, which was in the Kingdom of Mercia. Now, if you know, if you watched the previous video, you know that Æthelred had an association with Mercia through Ethelswith, because she was the Queen of Mercia, and the king was Burgred, and therefore his brother-in-law. So Burgred was like, yo, I need your help with Nottingham because the Vikings are in Nottingham. So ultimately, Æthelred and Alfred end up going towards Nottingham. They try and take Nottingham back, but ultimately the Vikings are unwilling to leave the safety of Nottingham. So with this, we then see as Burgred has to pay off the Vikings. So then they end up leaving for the time being. They were to go back to York, but then I believe it was in 868, yeah. In 868, they once again re-established their attack on East Anglia, and here we see as they actually kill King Edmund. Now, we don't really see anything dealing with the kingdom of Æthelred I until 870, when the Vikings are like, you know what, we're going to conquer Wessex. So, after having been kind of, not necessarily thwarted, but paid off in Mercia, they're like, yeah, we're going to go attack Wessex now. So they go to the southern border around the city of Reading. And what they take first is they actually march down to Reading. They take Reading on December 28th of 870. So with this, we then see as everyone's like, yo, they can't be invading our kingdom. So we see then as kind of local forces start to build up and all that. We actually see on December 31st of 870 as a local levy by the name of Ethelwulf, who's coincidentally named the same name as Ethelred's father, is able to fight back a large kind of harvesting party of the Vikings. And this is seen as a victory, though it is a minor one. So after that, we then see as Æthelred and Ethelwulf actually pull up to Reading to, I guess, actually have the main conflict going here rather than a little bit of a foraging squabble. So we see as Æthelred and Ethelwulf ultimately prepare to fight King Balseg and King Halfdan at the Battle of Reading. And once they get to the Battle of Reading, they are able to clear out the entirety of the surrounding area at the town. They are able to deal with all the Viking forces there easily. However, once they actually reach the town, the Vikings spill out in like immense power. And they also had built up like, not bulwarks, but like walls of dirt. They dug ditches and all that. So they had essentially prepared themselves for a siege. And once the Wessexian forces pulled up to Reading, we then see the Vikings just spill out and absolutely obliterate the Wessex forces. We actually see as Ethelwulf, who had joined up with Æthelred and Alfred, is killed here, and ultimately Æthelred and Æthelred and Alfred are only able to escape because they knew the land well, because they were familiar with their own kingdom. So we see as they're able to flee and kind of recoup and prepare their forces. And as this is happening, we see then as the Vikings kind of follow them. And then on December 8th of 1871, or not 1871, 871, I don't know, I keep feeling like I said 1871. But yeah, so Battle of Inglefield was the foraging battle, which happened on December 31st of 870. Then we had the Battle of Reading on January 4th, 871. And then now we have the Battle of Ashdown, which happens on January 8th, 871. And we see here that the Wessex forces actually get an immense win. So what we see is ultimately how they prepared was the Viking forces had divided their forces among the kings and the earls. They had separated them up, so they had two forces. And they had actually got there first, so they had the better defensible position, and they were prepared for the Wessex forces. However, Æthelred and Alfred are like, you know what, this is a good idea, so we're going to copy them. So we see as they divide their forces amongst their kings and their earls. So at first, we then see as the battle grows closer, Æthelred's like, you know what, I gotta go and partake in mass because it is a important religious, institution, especially for the Catholic Church at the time. And if you remember, he was the spiritual son of Pope Leo IV. So he is obviously a very religious man. So we see then as he goes to respect Mass. However, Alfred's like, you know what, I want to go fight. But Ethelred's not joining him. And Ethelred refuses to quit his Mass early. So ultimately, Alfred's like, you know what, crap on this. So he ends up sending all of his forces against Halfdan and Balseg. Balsecg. I'm going to say Balseg. And we see then, as though he is outpositioned, I believe outnumbered, he is able to effectively beat the Vikings here without ever the help of, well, actually the help of Æthelred did come later, but the first attack didn't. Once Æthelred got done with Mass, he ultimately ended up sending his troops in. So it's really debatable here because some people see this as a point of cowardice for Æthelred because he didn't want to send in his forces. However, and multiple contemporaries saw it as that. However, most historical, like military historians, recognize that, this was a good decision because if Alfred hadn't have been winning, it would be better for him to have lost a minor part of his army than the whole army, with Æthelred having sent his forces in as well. So it was actually a very strategic and play. I don't believe it was necessarily strategic. I just believe Æthelred wanted to complete his Mass service. And I don't know why, but this really kind of reminds me of like biblical battles and like Numbers and Deuteronomy and stuff like that, where Moses would stay behind and would like hold his arms up, and all the battle would be going on. Like Joshua would be down there fighting the battles. Like I don't know why that reminds me of it, but like it really does. And I really enjoyed seeing how devout Æthelred is here because it's debatable, but I believe he was really just a man of religion, and he wanted to stay and worship God because he knew that, I guess, God was more important than the battle that was ahead of him, even though the battle ahead of him threatened the entirety of his kingdom. So that was just super cool. And yeah, it does suck that that's kind of used to undermine him in history and like, deem him as a coward, but I do still believe that he did it in good faith because I believe he just wanted to complete the Mass. So with that, we then see as it kind of turns for the Wessex forces once more. So they do end up suffering a relatively bad defeat at the Battle of Basing, which is the royal I believe it's the royal city. I don't know if it's necessarily the capital, but Basing is ultimately taken, and Æthelred and Alfred are defeated. And we then see as one of the final major battles that happened during Æthelred's reign was on March 22nd at the battle known as the Battle of Meriton. It's not exactly known where this battle was, but it's just referred to as the Battle of Meriton. And at the Battle of Meriton, we see as they suffer a massive defeat, and multiple of their higher-ups end up dying, multiple higher-up officers. And it's not necessarily known how Æthelred died, but it's presumed that he died from wounds of this, because it is later in, I believe, Easter of that year fell on April 15th, so April 15th, 871. He did end up dying sometime around there. So it is believed that he died due to wounds suffered here, but also that seems like a kind of a long time to die, but it's also believable. So with that, we ultimately see as Æthelred's story kind of comes to an end. After this, Alfred would succeed him, and we would then see as he would continue to fight a war that had started in essentially 865 until 878, where he was able to defeat the Vikings pretty soundly. But yeah, so also I forgot to mention, but the army of Vikings that first set up in 865 was referred to as the Great Heathen Army, if you want to do some research into that, which is heavily interesting, so I'd highly recommend doing it. But yeah, so that is kind of the life of Æthelred. He was a man of, he was given a crappy hand to play with, but he dealt with it as good as he could. And I do really respect him for, like I said, being a very religious man like he was, because he wasn't going to fight a battle because Mass wasn't over yet, which is sick, honestly. And also because he was the first to face the first major king of Wessex to face such a horde of Vikings, such had never been seen before, such a renewed desire to conquer. These were conquerors, these weren't Vikings as they had seen prior. These weren't pillagers, they were conquerors. So that was just really cool to see how pretty well, though he did get defeated a lot, how well he was able to uphold against the Vikings, and how Alfred did so afterwards. Even though they did suffer a lot of defeat, they did ultimately end up beating the Vikings, which is very cool. But yeah, so I guess I'll kind of speak about one of the bigger things of Alfred's legacy. So, one of, like I said, the major things in Alfred's legacy was, I didn't say this, but how he is most often remembered is due to how the economy was affected during his time. So, at the time, the I guess, area of Wessex and all that predominantly just used a silver penny coin. And before him, Ethelbert had used this thing known as the Florentine cross penny, and Æthelred used this for the first couple of years of his reign, I believe until 868. And then after this, he ended up swapping his coin up to what is known as the lunette, yeah. And with the lunette, he did this, well, it's actually not known why he did this, but a kingdom that was directly adjacent, known as Mercia, who was ruled by his sister and his brother-in-law Burgred, used the same lunette. And they've been using it for a little bit longer, I believe 12 years prior. And we see as ultimately Æthelred ends up swapping his coinage to this essentially exact same coinage. And with this, we then see as there is a united coin system between these two kingdoms, and they can therefore partake in commerce with the same currency between both of the kingdoms. Now, this is important because it is a very basic and rudimentary foundation of what would later become the Kingdom of England, because it united two of the largest kingdoms in the area. Because, still you have Northumbria, Wales, and East Anglia. But it's still a very rudimentary Kingdom of England, though not united in name, but in currency. So this is just really cool to see this first unifying act done by Æthelred. And it's not necessarily known why he did it. It's believed that he did because, like I said, the legacy of the currency, how it had been already in use in Mercia for almost 12 years, and also because of the strength of the Mercian economy. Kind of like how the USD is the world exchange currency, because though the USD isn't the most valuable currency, it is associated with the largest economy on the planet, or one of the largest economies on the planet. So it's kind of a similar idea to that, but it was also likely just to help kind of unify the people of Mercia and Wessex, because they did have a close alliance, as we saw with Alfred and Æthelred helping Burgred with Nottingham and all of that. So that is all there really was to the history of Æthelred I. He reigned for a short time, I believe only 5 years. It wasn't even a full 6 years, even though he did reign until 865 to 871, but he didn't get his complete 6th year in. So honestly, I loved learning about him because I've always loved the name Æthelred. Like I said, I memorized the English kings and queens' names, and I just really wanted to look into him because I've always loved his name, and I thought it was really interesting, and I looked into him, and I really enjoyed reading about him. A very interesting character, though there's not too much on him. But that's all it really is for the life of Æthelred I, and that's all it really is for this episode of Unscripted History. So thank you very much for watching once more. I'm probably going to be making some more of these. It'll be over random crap that comes to mind whenever I feel like studying something. So thank you very much once more.